Ryan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, first of all, let's talk about this movie, The Conqueror. Obviously, it tells the story of Genghis Khan, but what many people don't know is that it was filmed near a nuclear test site that had taken place a few years before this movie was filmed. Do you want to talk about that nuclear test experiment and then what led to the movie being filmed near that?
Absolutely. So in the early 50s, the Cold War was at its peak, and the government, the US government had chose to conduct these experiments in what is now, a lot of people call it the most bombed place on Earth, the Nevada Proving Grounds, which is about 150 miles north of Las Vegas. And there was a lot of particular tests in the 1952-53, I guess you could call it a nuclear testing proving season that expelled a lot of nuclear fallout. And so this is sort of the radioactive material that would be left after one of these tests, and a lot of wind, particularly on this test that they did called Upshot-Knothole. There was a lot of fallout that blew east to a town called St. George, Utah. And it started to all build up in this area, particularly Snow Canyon. And about a year and a half later, they started scouting and wanted to make this film, The Conqueror, which was produced by RKO Pictures when Howard Hughes, who made mostly terrible movies when he was the studio head at RKO. And he wanted this to be his big, giant epic that would save the studio because its future was looking kind of grim. It looked like the studio was going to go bankrupt. But they decided to film it there in Snow Canyon, just outside of St. George, Utah, and it was a pretty troubled shoot. It was such a mess because of all of the terrible weather and lack of experience. But ultimately, throughout the decades afterwards, crew members and cast members like John Wayne, Susan Hayward, director Dick Powell, they all started to get cancer and even pass away from it. And so there's this whole big, somewhat of an urban legend now, because ultimately about 100 people from this film all got cancer, and about 3/4 of those people passed away from it. So a lot of people consider this to be one of the most disastrous movies of all time. A lot of people think it could be cursed. There's a lot of rumors and myths put towards it, but yes, ultimately, we'll never quite know if it was these nuclear tests that played a role in these deaths, but we do know it did play a role in a lot of people's lives, like residents in St. George who did pass away from radioactive contamination. So, it's a bit speculative, but I do believe it definitely played a role in John Wayne and a lot of the other cast and crew members' deaths. And it's a fascinating story to behold.
Yeah, and you did a very good job at explaining that. I want to come back to the deaths of how many of these people ended up dying from cancer. First, I want to go back because in the 50s, when that initial nuclear test was done, first of all, what was the fascination with nuclear testing at that time? They believed it was the future of something at that time. What was kind of the mentality of nuclear testing at that point in history?
Well, that was something, I was a little worried going in writing the book because I am not a nuclear physicist. I don't understand the really nitty gritty of how to build an atomic bomb, let alone detonate one. But I was just shocked at the way people viewed it at that time. That was sort of what got me really interested in telling the story, because it was new and exciting once the bombs were dropped on Japan ending World War II. The US felt invincible, and they started doing tests in the Marshall Islands and a few other Pacific Islands, and the fallout wasn't really known. A lot of islanders ultimately got sick and died, and then that happened on the U.S. mainland as well. But people weren't really aware of this until the mid 60s. In that time, the whole focus was on fighting communism and beating the Soviet Union. And so people were invited to come watch these nuclear tests unfold. It was American history in the making. So people would actually come and witness these tests. People were flying to Las Vegas just so they could feel the rumble of the nuclear tests nearby. There was atomic-themed cocktails and Miss Atomic Bomb fashion shows. Even the bikini gets its name from Bikini Atoll, where nuclear tests were happening. So it was a very marketable and a not well understood industry. So you get a lot of comic books during that time where people get super radioactive powers, and a lot of other stories that paint it more in a positive light. And it took, I would say, about 2 decades for it to really shift, and the Conqueror definitely plays a role in getting people's opinions and beliefs in nuclear testing to a different level, where they could see that no, there's a lot of terrible misguided beliefs and misguided science through the Atomic Energy Commission. And maybe they did overlook a lot of the aftermath that they didn't expect.
So when we look back on that period of time, kind of in retrospect with the lens we have now, like there was all this, it was almost like this nostalgic, romanticized view of atomic energy. Why was it so appealing to people at that time?
Well, first it was, they cracked the code, and so really it's starting off as an American triumph when they first did the Trinity tests in the early 1940s. They proved they had this capability, and so the U.S. seemed unstoppable at that point. But then it shifted more towards, well, we have to stay on top of this because the Soviet Union had nuclear capabilities, and I believe France later on also got nuclear capabilities. And so it became this, the Cold War ultimately leading to Cuba and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So that was, I would say, another sort of shifting point. But people were probably very proud for that time. They were excited that they had this capability, and it didn't seem like a big threat until that moment. You would see, and that was one of the interesting things to me, is watching the old duck and cover videos that they would make with this singing turtle named Bert, who would introduce, okay, if there is a nuclear threat, go under your desk, kids. And it was treated in just such a light regard up until the mid 60s. So, I think that pride lasted way too long.
Yeah. And then, of course, you had talked about, it began with this nuclear test experiment in Nevada, or excuse me, it was in Nevada. It was 150 miles from St. George, you said?
Yes.
And it was called Operation Upshot-Knothole.
Yes.
You want to talk more specifically about like what this experiment was? What was it they were trying to accomplish with that?
Well, there were so many different tests, and they had a lot of different just mind-boggling experiments when you think about it now. They would do different experiments where they would have models of homes, and they would detonate these bombs, and these homes were supposed to be a to scale representation of what the average American was living in. So they would fill them with mannequins. They would put them with J.C. Penney clothing and what people would have in their homes, all these different products. And then they would see, well, can we, as Americans with what we live in, withstand the blast here? So they did a lot of tests in that series because trying to prove that. They were also took a bunch of different infrastructure, like they would get material that a bridge might have been made out of, or they even had a safe that they tried to blow up. It was a lot of just trying to understand the capabilities of nuclear testing and what you could or could not destroy. And then they also had the army with it too, and men would be near or in the midst of these nuclear blasts, and they would go through these exercises where they would be tunneling or try and withstand the blast. And then they just had such a little understanding of the aftermath that they would just hose the soldiers down, or they would wipe them off with a broom, and they would be good to go. But that's basically what they were trying to prove. And with this specific test, the Upshot-Knothole Harry shot is the one that they think is the one that had the most contamination, that blew because they detonated it during a windstorm. And so most of the fallout blew towards St. George. And the St. George people they were briefly concerned, and they were told not to worry, and that was that. So they didn't raise much of a stink trying to fight for their rights or question their safety until much later.
So really, they were trying to test really the capabilities of what they could do with nuclear power. So
Absolutely.
In 1956, when director Dick Powell and producer Howard Hughes are they've cast this movie called The Conqueror, and they're choosing a location for this movie to be filmed. Why in the world did they choose St. George, Utah? Did they know about the nuclear fallout? Was that widely publicized at the time?
It would have, well, the nuclear tests certainly would have been publicized. It was more than national news, but the fallout, there really wasn't much of a concern or knowledge at that point. So they wanted to make this movie, and they couldn't afford. They looked at North Africa, they looked at Mongolia, but it was just way too far away to spend that money. So they started scouting in Nevada, Utah, Arizona area. And they talked to the Chamber of Commerce with St. George, who showed them around, showed them Snow Canyon. They said, "This is great. This is absolutely perfect. It looks like the Gobi Desert, or at least what we think it might look like," and use it to represent audiences. And it was only
because of
a few.
Right? It's because of the Red Rock Canyons, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's that red soil, and so it was relatively close to the studio back in Hollywood too. So it was a win-win, and a lot of movies had shot in the area before. Like John Wayne had done a couple of movies. Like Hondo was a 3D Western that he did in the early 50s. There was a couple different productions that were shooting at that time in St. George area, not specifically where they filmed The Conqueror, but same general area. So, also in science pointed to this being the best possible place to make their movie. But then they didn't, when they shipped everyone out there and they established the sets, that's when they started to think and hear from the locals, "Oh yeah, there was the nuclear testing happening nearby. We went to go witness this," or there was some deaths of a few hundred sheep that was I think a few months before the Conqueror crew came. And so suspicions were kind of raised at that point. And it was John Wayne who said it would be un-American to step away from it now. And so he asked Howard Hughes, the producer, to go and double check and make sure it was okay. And he phoned up the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission. They said it was fine. John Wayne even brought a Geiger counter and wanted to go illustrate that no one needs to worry about nuclear fallout, and this machine would read the amount of radiation in the soil and in the area, and it was apparently off the charts. It was just dinging and buzzing like you wouldn't believe, and John Wayne just ultimately said, "Oh, this thing must be broken," and everyone forgot about it and just went on their merry way and filmed the movie. So there wasn't much of a concern until much later.
Near the time of this, when this movie was filmed, or a short time later, there were people in and around St. George where there were all these reported deaths.
Yes.
Some of these reports were linking it to the nuclear fallout, but I don't remember specifically, but it sounds like in the book there was a, the Atomic Energy Commission, the U.S. government, they kind of downplayed these reports.
Absolutely, yes.
What's the reason for that?
Because it would make them look bad. And so the AEC was the one who was in charge of conducting the tests and sort of the face of nuclear energy. And they really just lied their faces off constantly, just trying to downplay any sort of harm. And it wasn't until the early 60s that there was a few scientists who were noticing that there were a lot of kids who are getting unusual growths, a lot of kids who are getting cancer and even dying, even at birth. There was a lot of stillbirths happening in that area. And then just a lot of people getting a higher rate of cancer than compared to anywhere else. I don't know if in the entire country, but I believe in the region at least. And so it caught the attention of a few researchers, and they were looking into it because of also the sheep that I had previously mentioned there. That was the first clue, was sheep started dying because of the fallout, and the whole flocks were being wiped out. And so they linked it to some of the milk that the kids were drinking, that the nuclear contamination got into the animals that they were getting milk from. And so constant reports were being made, and the AEC would either refuse to publish them, acknowledge them, or they would just say, no, that's false. And so it took, a good 15 years, and the AEC was actually shut down by the Nixon administration. They said we are going to go in more of a cleaner, environmentally friendly direction. And so it wasn't until they were shut down in the mid 70s that people started to be able to get their findings out and talk more about what would ultimately be called the downwinder syndrome.
Going back to the actual filming of The Conqueror, you talk about in your book how Susan Hayward and John Wayne, many of the actors involved, they got sick during the filming.
Yes.
And part of that may have been due to just the extreme heat. But there was also, some speculation or some rumor that possibly some of that sickness was due to the radiation.
Yes. That's the hardest thing to prove now, because everyone has died. There's really no one left from the Conqueror. There's a handful of people, but they are in their mid to late 90s now. And most of the people at the time were smokers. That's a lot of what this book is about, is the evolution of that, and how John Wayne got cancer in the early 60s. And it caused him to quit smoking and start doing public service announcements for the American Cancer Society. But up until that point, there was a rumor that he would light his next cigarette with the current one that he was smoking, and it would just serve him throughout the entire day because he would be smoking so many. So when you hear a fact like that, you obviously gravitate to, well, yeah, I think smoking definitely played a part in his getting lung cancer, and then ultimately succumbing to pancreatic cancer in the late 70s. So a lot of people's defense is that it was smoking and nothing more. He was also a heavy drinker. A lot of the cast members, like Susan Hayward, had alcohol addictions. So there are a lot of other factors in there. But when you look at the whole group, like out of 220 people, I mean, half of those people got cancer, and more than half of those people passed away. If we looked at a random sample, you would never get those statistics again. And they also used a lot of extras who were part of the native tribes in Arizona and Nevada to be part of these big Mongolian epic battle scenes. And they treated them quite poorly. They paid them less than $1 a day, but that would significantly add to the death total because there were so many people working on set who weren't documented, and we'll never know who was on that set and who passed away. But I think that would significantly sway the numbers to show that, yeah, indeed, so many people did get cancer because they were in this wrong spot at the wrong time.
What's the state of nuclear testing today?
Well, that was, I don't want to say luck, but the sort of the timing with this book. I started writing it and doing the research as North Korea was doing their nuclear tests. And so as a result, there's that doomsday clock, and they moved it the closest to midnight as it had ever been, except for the moment when The Conqueror was being filmed and the nuclear tests were happening at that moment. So, we're at a very strange, heightened moment where you have other countries, particularly North Korea, as major nuclear threats. The U.S. hasn't done testing since 1992, and a lot of, in fact, the bulk of countries on Earth have signed this treaty not to do nuclear testing. The U.S. has not ratified that yet. They've acknowledged it, but they've not, since the late 90s that they put this forward, this treaty. The U.S. still, they've acknowledged it's a thing, it's a good idea, but they've never officially signed on to it, essentially. So the U.S. could start doing nuclear tests at any moment, at any day, basically, and I think it's a interesting moment, an interesting continuation or sequel to the Cold War, and we have more countries than ever who are have nuclear capabilities. So it's definitely not as active as it was in the 50s, but it's it's definitely just as prevalent.
The book is called Killing John Wayne, The Making of the Conqueror, and that's available wherever you can get books, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever. Ryan, I appreciate you taking some time with me today. Is there anything else you'd like to add as we wrap this up?
Well, I recommend people check out the movie. It is hard to find, but it's definitely worth the watch because it is such a strange moment in history, not only because of the nuclear testing background, but just watching Wayne's performance, watching how royally they screw up history with Genghis Khan and sort of any kind of authenticity. They set off to make what they called a Chinese Western, and the movie has really nothing to do with Chinese or the West. So
Right.
it's fascinating to watch as a movie that just implodes and was made for all the wrong reasons. So yeah, I highly recommend it if you can find it.
Yeah, and knowing the backstory, it kind of makes you want to watch it now, having read the book. But like you say, it's hard to find. Hopefully you can find it somewhere. I'm sure you can rent it on YouTube, if nothing else.
Yes, I've tracked down a copy. You can get them from Universal. They print them on demand on DVD. So that's an option.
Very cool. Well, Ryan, thanks again. It's been a fascinating conversation, and love the book. Appreciate you taking some time today.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me.